Part 3, Chapter 1 of the case of Charles Dexter Ward, we find that Charles Ward has gone to Salem, Massachusetts to learn more about Joseph Curwen. We learn that Joseph was born in Salem Village. At the age of 15, he ventured at sea for 9 years before returning to make Salem his home. Curwen had two close friends, Edward Hutchinson and Simon Orne, and it was the witchcraft panic that forced him and Edward to leave the Salem area. As Ward goes looking through some papers that once belonged to Simon Orne, he's amazed to find a letter that was written by Curwen himself. It's a striking discovery, because the letter tells him the location of Curwen's house in Olney Court, which happens to be within a few blocks of the Ward family home. Charles Ward finds an old couple living in the Curwen house, and they are kind enough to allow him to investigate the premises. Careful examination unveils a portrait of Joseph Curwen painted into the wall above the fireplace. Ward and his family are very surprised by how much Joseph Curwen looks remarkably like Charles Dexter Ward, though his mother isn't pleased with the thought of bringing the picture home. After it's been extracted from its place in the wall, Ward is astounded to find some old papers in the brickwork, along with an antique journal that once belonged to Joseph Curwen himself. In Chapter 3, we find Charles Ward devouring the Curwen material. Joseph Curwen's portrait is brought home and installed in Ward's room, where the young man starts to become isolated as he pursues his work. His parents start to worry as we find out that Ward's ideas have shifted from the mere study of antiquities to that of magic and the occult. As he grows more persistent in his research, we learn that Ward has locked onto a clue that is very important to him because it holds the key to finding Joseph Curwen's grave. As we move through the story of Charles Dexter Ward, our perspective changes with the motion of the narrative. We began with a bird's eye view of Ward's life, but we found ourselves occupying Ward's mental space when we were learning about Joseph Curwen. During these episodes, we were taken a step further by occupying the perspective of Joseph Curwen's peers as they embarked on the task of dealing with him as a threat to the community. But we never left Ward's point of view until we began to see the effects of Curwen's life on Charles Ward. And then our focus shifted from observing Ward, observing Joseph Curwen, to observing Charles Dexter Ward himself. The third person, omniscient, is functioning like a camera lens that makes adjustments as needed to convey the story. Because the omniscient viewpoint can be overwhelming in its scope, in its position as a wide open space with room for all the details. Though I've touched on the subject of textual discrepancies in the past, it seems that with the continuing multiple reproductions of a text, it's an issue that will probably remain for the duration. At the very least, I can make my point in relation to the appearance of Yog-Sothoth, who was making his first appearance in the case of Charles Dexter Ward. And this is how I can lead into making my point. It begins with one version of the online text stating that Joseph Curwen was not ready for hard fortunes. Another version, however, states that he was, and this is what it says in my printed edition as well. And so to think of Joseph Curwen as a man who was unprepared had me confused. Joseph Curwen seems like a man who was ready for anything. I later found that the grammatical phrasing was incorrect during the first reading. It was supposed to be in double negative. Joseph Curwen was, in fact, not unready for his hard fortunes. That means he was perfectly prepared. Without double checking, my impression of Joseph Curwen would never have changed. But in a fun sort of way, we can look at what it means to misconstrue a phrase that has been improperly transcribed. Imagine you're stuck in another dimension of time and you're trying to get back to your home world. The local shaman says that he can help with the aid of a special book that can be found in the woods. In order to gain a hold of the book, however, you have to speak the word Klaatu Barada Nikto. But when you get to the book, you've forgotten a part of the phrase, and you say something without saying the exact words. And in the process, you unleash a deadly force that wants to kill you and everyone else. We can be a little more serious as it pertains to the occult science that has been working its way into the story of Charles Dexter Ward, because a misspoken word when trying to summon a being like Yog-Sothoth could mean serious problems. Am I right? What this all means is that words have more power than we think. For example, what do you think of someone who is prepared versus someone who is unprepared? It creates a very large discrepancy in judgment. I've never meant for anything like a simple typo to turn into a situation that makes me sound like I'm being petty. But the truth is, this textual discrepancy is one of several that I've encountered so far, and the effect grows to become accumulative the more I find, which can threaten to encroach on the interpretive medium. At the level of sheer reality, what I'm really talking about is the phenomenon of textual transference down through the ages, and how what we read shapes our view of the world, with particular reference to what that could mean when items have been put down incorrectly, and what we are to believe from there. We have reached the point where Charles Dexter Ward has seemed to reach the apex of his research, even though we don't know what's next. What I mean to say is that it's been exhausting, watching Ward go from records to archives, to city halls, to libraries, to athenaeums, to institutes, to schools and to state houses, to historical societies, to the homes of personal individuals. It reminds me of a show I used to watch called The History Detectives. Remember that show? The tension was always thick as we waited to find out whether or not some bit of local history was true or not. And it seems to me that Charles Dexter Ward would have found a good home with this group. That is, had not Joseph Curwen been his ancestor. Have you ever researched a subject until your mind was on the brink? Until you realized that you had to have an answer no matter what the cost?